Welcome to an installment of CCSD Living Environment. Today we're going to talk about trophic levels, and we're going to talk about the flow of energy in an ecosystem. For an ecosystem to be self-sustaining or stable, it must contain a flow of energy. Energy is passed on to other organisms in the form of food. Since all organisms use energy for their own metabolic needs or life functions, most energy is lost before it can be passed on to the next step in the food chain. So you would think by the time you get to the top of the food chain that you would have the most energy, but that's simply not true. And the reason why is because every organism before you didn't pass all of its energy on to you. It had to use some of that energy for itself to undergo the basic life functions: nutrition, respiration, growth, transport, synthesis, regulation, reproduction. So you have to use some of that energy for yourself. So when an organism eats another organism, it's not getting all of the energy that that organism that was eaten potentially had. And we need to look at why that is. As a result, organisms high on the food chain have less energy available to them and must have a smaller population. So if I start out with grass, the mouse eats the grass, the snake eats the mouse. The grass is going to have a relatively large population in comparison to the snake, who's going to have a small population. And part of that is because each time something is eaten, less and less energy is passed on to the next set of organisms. So because there's not as much energy available, your population needs to be smaller. Autotrophs. An autotroph is an organism with the ability to obtain their energy from sunlight and synthesize or make their own food from raw materials. Those raw materials being carbon dioxide and water. Now we know that that process is called photosynthesis, and that it's the green plants and algae that actually undergo that process. So they're going to start this whole thing off. They're going to take that energy from the sun, and they're going to convert it into something that everything else is able to use. Energy for a community is determined by the amount of green plants and algae. If you don't have a lot of plants in the community, you can't have a lot of anything else. Because remember, everything is dependent on something else in the ecosystem. So the green plants set it off. If the plant population decreases, that affects every other population in the ecosystem. Heterotrophs. The heterotrophs are the organisms that cannot synthesize their own food, so they have to depend on another organism for food. So photosynthesis does not take place with a heterotroph. What we need to do is go through and look at the different types of heterotrophs, and there's a few of them. We're going to start with saprophytes. Saprophytes are also known as decomposers. Decomposers live on dead matter and recycle materials in the environment to be used by other living organisms. Our examples would be fungus and bacteria. Something to keep in mind here, if you go back to those factors to maintain a stable ecosystem, what did we need? Constant input of energy from the sun, producers to use the sun's energy, and then decomposers. Not humans, not lions, not wolves, not bears, but decomposers. They have to take the materials when things are dead, or the waste products from those things, and put the nutrients back into the earth. Recycle things back into the system, back into the ecosystem. Decomposers play a huge role in ecosystem stability and also in that flow of energy. Then we need to look at our herbivores. Herbivores are animals that consume green plants, like your grazing animals, cows, horses, deer, rabbits, all the things that go out and eat the green plants. Those are your herbivores. Then that takes us to the carnivores. The carnivores are animals that consume other animals. Now, when it comes to a carnivore, we have two different options. You can be a predator or you can be a scavenger. A predator actually goes out and hunts and kills its prey. It goes out to hunt its food. It kills it itself and then consumes it. A wolf would be a good example of a predator. A scavenger, on the other hand, feeds on dead animals, but it doesn't kill them. Now, it may sit around and wait until something that did kill it is done eating, or maybe something dies because it's old or sick or diseased, and the scavenger comes along to eat it. Or maybe something scared away the initial predator, and the scavenger's there to clean up the pieces. So a vulture or a crab. And finally, the last one we need to look at is an omnivore. An omnivore is an animal that consumes both plants and animals, like a human or a bear. Something for you to know about an omnivore. Omnivores have decided, not consciously, but they have come to this conclusion that they have such a massive energy requirement. They need so much energy to survive that just eating plants or animals isn't enough. They need to eat both. And if you think about a human or a bear and the energy requirements for either of those animals, it would make sense why we would both fall into the category of an omnivore. The energy demand is just massive. So we've gone to eating both, plants and animals. Organisms are grouped by trophic or feeding levels, which describes the source of the organism's food. If you remember, that suffix troph meant feeding. So an autotroph is a self-feeder. A heterotroph is a different or other feeder. So when we talk about trophic levels, we're talking about feeding levels. The first level we're going to talk about is the producers. Our producers are our autotrophs. They use the energy directly from the environment or the sun. That would be our green plants and algae. They're undergoing photosynthesis. They're producing all of the energy for the ecosystem. They're taking the energy from the sun and converting it into a form that the rest of life can use. The second level we call primary consumers. Remember, if you consume something, you take it in. So a primary consumer would be an herbivore. They're organisms that feed on the producers or the green plants. So for example, it would be the caterpillar eating on oak tree leaves. Our third level is what we're going to call secondary consumers. They're the carnivores. They're organisms that feed on primary consumers. For example, the bird that eats the caterpillar that was eating the oak tree leaves. And that takes us to our fourth level, or tertiary consumers. Again, they're carnivores. Organisms that feed on secondary consumers. So it would be the hawk that comes along and eats the bird that ate the grasshopper that ate the oak tree leaves. So you're kind of getting this whole, like, there wasn't a lady who swallowed a fly song going. Similar idea. You keep moving up the food chain. The energy has to flow from one organism to another, and that energy can only flow in one direction. It can't go back. Once the snake has eaten the mouse, that's it. We can't go back to the mouse. The mouse is no longer there. Once the mouse has eaten the grass, we can't go back. The grass is no longer there. So what is that whole concept? That's the concept of a food chain. A food chain involves the transfer of energy from green plants through a series of organisms with repeated stages of eating and being eaten. So you're either the one that's being eaten or you're the one that's doing the eating. But that energy can only move in one direction. So let's take a look at a food chain. Well, before we can look completely at the food chain, we have to keep something in mind. The arrow represents who is being eaten, and it shows the flow of energy. So the arrow is going to point from the plant to the mouse to the snake. We're moving in that direction. That's the flow of energy. The mouse is eating the plant, the snake is eating the mouse. So you have to make sure that your arrow is showing you which way is the energy going. We want to talk about the flow of energy, the movement of energy from the producer to the primary consumer, to the secondary consumer, to the tertiary consumer. We want to talk about the movement of energy from the autotroph to the herbivore, to the carnivore, to the carnivore. So each time we want to show that energy moving up the food chain. From the bottom, remember, very large population, to the top, much smaller population. So if you think about this movement of energy in an ecosystem, is there only mice that eat green plants? Are there only snakes that eat mice? And I'm hoping your answer to that question is no. There could be a rabbit that eats the plant. There could be a snake that eats a rabbit. There could be a fox that eats the rabbit. There could be a fox that eats the mouse. There's multiple organisms in any ecosystem. And there's multiple organisms that are being eaten or eating the same organism. What do I mean by that? The green plant could be eaten by the mouse, the squirrel, the chipmunk, the rabbit. And then at the next level, they could, depending on size, obviously, be eaten by the snake, the coyote, the fox, maybe the human, if it's a rabbit, squirrel, maybe. So there's all of these relationships that are happening within that ecosystem. So when we look at all of these complex food chains that would work out, that becomes a food web. It would be like if I took a strand of yarn and I had all of you sitting in a big circle, and I said, just toss a strand of yarn to the next person, but you have to wrap it around your finger before you throw it. And if we just kept doing that for 20 minutes, by the time we were done, we would have this giant web of yarn. That web, each one of those connections would be a food chain. It's showing you the flow of energy from one organism to the next. So the complex interconnecting food chains in a community that will finally end with decomposers to recycle all of those materials, that's a food web. And if you look in your notes, it shows you a really nice picture of a food web. At the bottom, you've got all your producers, you've got the organisms that eat the producers, you've got the organisms that eat those organisms. And then it also shows you a few tertiary consumers in there as well. The thing that I want you to keep in mind is that the producers have the most energy. And if you look at that picture, it shows you off to the side. The most energy is at the bottom with your producers, the least energy is at the top with your top predators. Now, a top predator could be something as simple as a hawk, but still within that food chain, it has the least amount of energy. So every time you take another step up, you're losing energy. Hope you enjoyed the video on trophic levels. Have a good day.